All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third and final session of this year's class. And I'm glad you've shown the fortitude to persist through the end of the course. I think it should be an interesting conclusion. I've chosen a large topic this year, so I'm trying to give the highlights relating to what I think is a really important theme. And essentially, I'm going to recap give you a little tour of the highlights so that we can all be on the same page as we move through the final sources on my source sheet. But I want to make sure everyone realizes what I've been trying to address, which is very simply, but really importantly, the development of the Jewish legal tradition. So that's really what we're getting at. This is not an arcane or sort of obscure element of the development of halacha, of Jewish law, and the Jewish legal tradition really, I believe, lies at the center of Jewish thought and Jewish life through the centuries. This really cuts to the core of what it means for our tradition to have developed over time. And I'm hoping that we can appreciate by the end of today's session, you guys can appreciate the tension that is at the core of the tradition, that there was a Sinai revelation that is thought by tradition to have been the fountainhead of everything that we do, and was seen as the expression and conveyance by God of his word and his will to the people. So the revelation at Mount Sinai, and I have noted what I mean by the Sinai revelation is the actual revelation at Mount Sinai is recorded in the book of Exodus, but also all of the subsequent revelations during the following 39 years of wandering in the wilderness, because there were various occasions through which God communicated his will to Moses in the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed, or in the tabernacle, the Mishkan. So by Sinai revelation, I'm encompassing all of the wilderness revelations. Those are, in rabbinic thought, those are all sort of thought of together. That chronological distance is not meaningful. It's whatever happens after Sinai, the revelation at Mount Sinai, that is meaningful. And so what I've tried to establish and what we're going to continue to discuss today is the tension between this core divine revelation at Mount Sinai and everything that followed in expanding and elaborating on that tradition, and how all of that further expansion and elaboration was permissible in light of what I have called the no amendment clauses of the Torah. So with that, I'm going to share my screen again. And I hope that you can all see it now. So I've entitled, as you can see, I've entitled this last session, The Dynamics of Dual Authority, because as I've just tried to suggest, Jewish tradition is really built on and out of two sources of ultimate authority. One is God. Again, this is all with respect to classical Jewish thought and how really almost all pre-modern Jews thought about our system. One source of authority was God, as reflected in the Sinai revelation. But the other, perhaps equally important source of authority were the rabbinic sages through time, who did various things with respect to that divine revelation. They interpreted it, they created legislation with respect to it, and as I suggested at the end of last session, they even at times amended it, the original divine revelation. So this last session, we're going to discuss further the dynamics of those two sources of authority, that dual authority between God and the rabbis. So I'm going to give you a quick tour of highlights that we've covered so far to make sure that we all have sort of some fundamental principles in mind as we head into the final sources for this last class session. So the first two texts that I have discussed are what I have referred to as the no amendment clauses of the Torah. Both are from Deuteronomy. The important language here is, you shall not add anything to what I command you or take anything away from it. In the Hebrew, lo tosifu al hadavar asher anochi metzaveh etchem velo tigra'u mimenu. I have said that in rabbinic thought, this no amendment clause is called bal tosif, you shall not add, and bal tigra, you shall not subtract or take away. And for good measure, Deuteronomy repeats it. Be careful to observe only that which I enjoin upon you, neither add to it nor take away from it. Lo tosef alav velo tigra mimenu. As far as I know, in rabbinic, despite what we're going to talk about today, in rabbinic thought, I don't think the rabbis in particular distinguish between these two clauses. They thought of them in conjunction with each other, as reinforcing each other, to say, look, in its plain terms, don't add anything to what I'm giving you. God is telling the people through Moses, and don't take away anything from it. So those are the two no amendment clauses that we have addressed, that are the foundation of what we've been discussing. And I'm going to just give the highlights here. So another highlight that I tried to cover in my first session is that over time, the rabbinic sages became very suspicious of any people who might profess to be prophets, who might want to revise, amend, or alter the original divine revelation at Mount Sinai. And this is a famous midrash on the first two words of a verse from Leviticus, Ele HaMitzvot. And the rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud tractate Shabbat said, She'ein hanavi rashai lechadesh davar me'ata, that Ele HaMitzvot, these are the commandments. I'm adding emphasis because that's what was underlying this midrash. The word these underscores that a prophet is not permitted to innovate any new element from here on. And what they meant by that is, from the time after the Sinai revelation, we can't have prophets coming and saying, I know God told us to do this or that back then at Mount Sinai and during the wilderness wanderings, but I'm telling you now that we can revise it in X and Y ways. The rabbis were very suspicious of any prophets who might do that, even though, as we discussed in the first session, the Torah itself seems to suggest that Moses-like prophets might arise in the future. The rabbis were suspicious of any such prophets, and they had reason to be, in light of, for example, the newly innovated religion of Christianity, in which a prophet said, oh, by the way, we can largely do away with the laws of this prior testament, or at least that's how Jesus was interpreted later, that the old revelation, it can be superseded by a new one. That phenomenon the rabbis were very suspicious of. So they had a sort of cynicism about new prophecy that might seek to alter the law. Another highlight, we saw this was an important early medieval work called Sefer HaChinuch, the Book of Education. And we saw here that this really encapsulates a rabbinic principle or a rabbinic perspective about the Torah. It was written there that the master of the world, God, who commanded us about the Torah, blessed be he, is completely perfect. So God is perfect. And all of his acts and commands are perfect and good. And one of his acts and commands was his giving us the Torah. So all of his communications to us are embodied in the Torah. And so as a consequence, or as an implication or inference of this first principle about the perfection of God, is that the Torah too is also perfect. And therefore, the no amendment clause makes sense. And so adding to them, meaning God's commandments in his perfect Torah, really amounts to a detraction, and all the more so subtracting from them. This is a clear matter. So essentially, if we do anything to revise or change in any way a perfect product, we're taking away from its perfection. That's the sort of principle underlying the no amendment clauses. Then we looked here. In the problem is, in light of the no amendment clauses of the Torah, there are clearly gaps in the law. The Torah law that God revealed to the people in the wilderness was not all-encompassing, was not fully comprehensive. It was filled with gaps that had to be filled. And the Torah itself displays that characteristic of the Torah. Even if it might have been thought of as perfect, it was incomplete with respect to practical reality. This we had discussed was the story in the book of Numbers in the Pentateuch about the wood gatherer on the Sabbath day. They knew it was wrong, but they didn't know what should be done to him. And then God told Moses, by the way, here's a new aspect of the revelation. That wood gatherer on the Sabbath should be put to death, and so they did. So in the Torah, within the scheme and scope of the original revelation at Mount Sinai and during the wilderness, there was a vehicle, there was a mechanism to supplement the Torah. They still had ready access to God through Moses, and Moses could simply find out from God how to fill in the gaps. So in the Torah, that happens in a few places. The problem, as I mentioned, is that after Moses died, we lost that ready access. The Torah itself at the end of Deuteronomy says there was never a prophet like Moses. And so the immediate access that we had to God, God's accessibility that would allow us to further supplement the revelation, seemed to have been foreclosed after Moses' death. So the way we could supplement during Moses' lifetime no longer was applicable after he was no longer our leader. So that begs the question: how do we fill in the gaps in light of the no amendment clauses without access to a prophet like Moses? So getting to the no amendment clause, Bal Tosif, this was Rashi's very sort of succinct summary of what the Talmudic rabbis meant by "you shall not add." I mean, Lo Tosifu is from the Torah, but the rabbis interpreted it to mean don't place 5 biblical passages in the Tefillin instead of 4, or 5 species of plants on Sukkot instead of 4, etc. That's how, and thus too we must similarly explain don't take away from it. So I said that according to this more narrow conception of Bal Tosif and Bal Tigra, the no amendment clause, it seems as if quantitative changes to existing commandments are what are encompassed within the no amendment clauses. And again, that's not self-evident. It seems to perhaps exclude from the purview of the no amendment clauses creating new commandments from scratch, which would not fall directly within the description that Rashi gives here. Moving on, I started to suggest, and we're going to continue the discussion today, about the power of rabbinic interpretation to essentially generate new laws that, at least on first blush, seem to run afoul of the no amendment clauses. Here's an example that we're going to come back to at the end of today's session. This is in the book of Numbers, in the Chumash, in the Torah. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, there shall be a Passover sacrifices. So this is about the holiday of Passover. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days, but the first day shall be a sacred occasion. Bayom harishon mikra kodesh. So only the first day, the Torah tells us, shall be distinguished by its holiness. But as we know, we just recently celebrated Pesach, Passover, and the first 2 days in the diaspora are celebrated as Yom Tov, as Yontif, as special days of sacred activity on which we can't do certain work, just like very similar to Shabbat. So one might think, well, how do we rationalize, justify a second day of Yontif, a second day of the holiday, if the Torah explicitly says celebrate only the first day as a sacred occasion. This seems to violate Rashi's principle, don't add or detract quantitatively to the instructions, to the commandments of the Torah. Okay, moving on. We saw, to continue the discussion of the great power of the rabbis to interpret the Torah and to thereby generate new meaning and new laws, not just agadic interpretation, but actually legal additions to the Torah. And we started the discussion of, well, how does that jive? How does that comport with the no amendment clauses? But the power of rabbinic interpretation with respect to the plain text of the Torah is enormous. And I gave some examples. Here, the fifth verse of the entire Torah, God called the light day and called the darkness night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. That gave rise to the entire system of the Jewish calendar, that the rabbis decided that Jewish days really start the night before. So that means that Shabbat and every Jewish holiday starts the evening before, not, let's say, at a minute after midnight or sometime in the morning. Jewish time is different from what we know of as secular time. And the rabbis extracted all of that meaning from very few Hebrew words at the beginning of Genesis. And really the entire Jewish calendar is structured on that premise that Jewish time with respect to the creation of special days starts the evening before. Another example, we saw in Exodus, you shall serve the Lord your God, who will bless your bread and your water, and I will remove sickness from your midst. Again, I mentioned this, it's sort of seemingly a mundane, important, but routine verse in the Torah that we should serve God. He's going to bless us if we do. But the rabbis, again, generated or extracted enormous meaning from these four Hebrew words, Va'avadatem et Hashem Elohechem, that you should serve your God. From those four Hebrew words, they generated the positive affirmative commandment that we have to pray every day. So from those four Hebrew words, as we saw in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides' great code of Jewish law, it is a positive Torah commandment to pray every day, citing this proof text that I just read. You shall serve the Lord your God. And he went through a whole proof that service means service from the heart. Service from the heart is prayer. And therefore, essentially, the rabbinic tradition is telling us it is a Torah commandment. It is a commandment from the Torah, from God, that we need to pray every day, even though, I want to make clear, the Torah doesn't tell us anywhere that we have to pray every day. But they determined through their interpretation that it was actually a divine commandment to set aside time to pray every day. It wasn't something that they were making up or adding. Now, that enormous power of the rabbis to interpret the Torah, they derived, perhaps ironically, through their powers of interpreting the Torah itself. So the outcome was the rabbis have great powers of interpretation, and they decided that they could derive those powers or that authority from Deuteronomy. The end here, it said, you shall act in accordance with the instructions given you by magistrate judges or judges through time, and the ruling handed down to you. You must not deviate from the verdict that they announced to you, either to the right or to the left. Lo tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin usmol. These two Hebrew words, lo tasur, you should not deviate, became sort of a motto of the rabbis and a principle of theirs, that their majority consensus, the consensus that through which they arrived at what they believed was the determination of the divine will as reflected in the Torah, that became equally authoritative, essentially, as any plain meaning of the Torah, and that we didn't have discretion, individual Jews did not have discretion to deviate from that majority consensus. So this principle, lo tasur, don't deviate, became in some sense, and we'll see it in just a moment, in some sense, a competing principle directly in competition with the no amendment clauses. So on the one hand, we have clauses from the Torah that say, don't change the Torah, don't add to it, don't take away from it. On the other hand, this is this is from a verse in the Torah, and lo tasur became a competing principle that was derived also from the Torah. So we can have these twin competing principles of no amendment on the one hand, and don't deviate from the rabbis on the other. Clearly that competition would give rise to a system of dual authority that gives rise to what the title for this session. So the rabbis, one could say, gave themselves great powers with respect to deriving meaning from the Torah, but not just deriving meaning, also sort of controlling the fate of the text of the Torah. And they did it in three ways that we mentioned last time. We'll get back to the first one, interpretation. I think that was the most important vehicle of their rabbinic authority vis-a-vis the text of the Torah. They derived laws, and I'm using the word derived, but we'll get to we have to figure out what they were exactly doing when they interpreted the Torah in light of the no amendment clauses. But one vehicle of their authority was interpretation. Another was legislation. They actually created new legislation in which they said, this isn't in the Torah, but do X or Y, or don't do Z. So there was positive legislation, there was negative legislation, and all of that can be summed up in terms of the legislation. We'll get back to interpretation, but in terms of legislation, to the idea of creating a fence around the Torah. So we discussed last time the very first Mishnah in the tractate Avot, Pirkei Avot, talks about this. This is usually the portion that is discussed about the transmission of the Torah. But at the end of it, it says, be patient. They said three things. So these are three really important principles. Be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. Va'asu sayag la Torah. That principle of making a fence around the Torah through rabbinic legislation was really important. And I showed how Maimonides, in giving his commentary on Pirkei Avot, showed, and he was conveying what the Talmud concluded, that creating a fence around the Torah is itself a divine mandate. The rabbis had discretion to create these legislative fences around the Torah because the Torah says, guard my guarding. And so the rabbis derived from that phrase in the Torah their authority to create not just laws through interpretation, but also laws through really brand new legislation that would protect what was in the Torah itself. Then finally, we saw last time that the rabbis not only arrogated to themselves the power to interpret the Torah first, and the power, secondly, to legislate, to protect the contours and substance of the Torah, but they also said, we can actually, despite the no amendment clauses in Deuteronomy, we can actually amend the Torah in certain circumstances. I'm not going to go back to what we discussed, but essentially, as Maimonides says here, any rabbinic court may uproot, so may alter, may amend even the words of the Torah as a matter of ad hoc, temporary exigency, hora'at sha'ah, if the hour of the times dictates that the rabbis suspend a law of the Torah or add something to it, they can do so. That is that. If they hadn't come up with a rationale for it, that would have been in direct violation of the no amendment clauses. But the rabbis determined they had the right even to amend the Torah in certain circumstances based on this principle of trying to preserve the Torah for the longer term. So if in the short term, it needed to be altered or amended or suspended in some way, it was for the betterment of our commitment to the Torah over time. As Maimonides said, the sages of prior generations said, desecrate one Sabbath for a person's sake so that he will keep many Sabbaths. The idea that for pikuach nefesh, for the preservation of health, we can violate the Shabbat so that that person who is at risk of endangerment can celebrate and observe many Shabbatot in the future. The same is true, the rabbis argued, of law, of the Torah law more generally, that the divine law could be altered in certain extreme circumstances so that our commitment to the law could be sustained and preserved over time. Okay. The last sort of old text that I want to review quickly before I move on to my new sources was this passage from Rabbi Joel Roth's book, The Halachic Process. He wrote this book shortly before I took a JTS Rabbinical School Talmud class with him. And he wrote there, in crystallizing this problem that I've been trying to describe, the rabbis were aware of this tension between God's divine authority as reflected in the Torah that contains amendment clauses that say, don't add to me and don't take away from me. The tension between that divine authority and their own authority to interpret, to flesh out, to elaborate God's will as reflected in the Torah. And that rose to the level of even granting themselves the power of amendment in certain circumstances. Rabbi Roth wrote, in theological terms, the problem may be stated like this: if the power of the sages includes even the right to amend or abrogate the undisputed or accepted will of God, as embodied in those norms designated as deoraita from the Torah. So if the rabbis gave themselves the right to amend or abrogate even divine laws, is it not the case that the system recognizes the sages as God, rather than recognizing God as God? And if this is the case, does it not follow that the God-centered legal system has collapsed because of the sages' usurpation of God's place within it? So Rabbi Roth is setting up the tension that if on the one hand there are no amendment clauses, and on the other, the rabbis gave themselves the power to amend the Torah in certain circumstances, were they essentially displacing God at the center of the Jewish legal system? Now, I did know Rabbi Roth is a halachically committed Jew. He didn't believe that the sages really were displacing God, even though he recognized very articulately in that book and in great detail the power of the rabbis vis-a-vis the divine text of the Torah. But he didn't think they were doing anything wrong. We're going to get back to Rabbi Roth and how he actually decides and how he says the system decides when alterations, amendments to the Torah are actually okay. When are they within the bounds of systemic discretion? And when are they not? When do they actually exceed the bounds of authority? So we're going to get back to that at the end of the session. But I thought Rabbi Roth very did a good job of sort of crystallizing the tension of the problem in light of the enormity of rabbinic power vis-a-vis the Torah. Okay, so I want to get back to what is really the underlying, these are new texts now, what is the underlying rationale of the no amendment clause? And the primary one usually is thought to be bal tosif, you shall not add to the Torah. And then sort of bal tigrad, don't take away, is sometimes seen as a secondary, a corollary principle. But what really underlies the no amendment clauses? Why are they there? This is from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin. Chizkiah says, from where is it derived that anyone who adds to the Torah actually subtracts from it? We saw before there the idea that the Torah, God is perfect, Therefore, his revelation embodied in the Torah is perfect. And so even if you think you're being a great pious Jew, and you say, oh, I know there are 4 species for the lulav and etrog on Sukkot, but I'm going to be super pious and add another one, make it 5. The idea that the rabbis conveyed is, no, that's actually, that added piety in that quantitative sense is actually subtracting from the Torah. So how do we know that? How do we know that adding to the Torah is essentially also diminishing it, taking away from it? And then there's sort of this mysterious answer. It is derived from a verse as it is stated that Eve said to the snake. So this is right near the beginning of the Torah in the book of Genesis. God said to the snake, Eve said to the snake that God said, you shall not eat of it, the tree of knowledge, or touch it. So that is a quote from Genesis chapter 3, verse 3. And so what does Chizkiah mean by that? There's a lot sort of embedded in that answer, and I want to try to unpack it. So let's look back at Genesis chapter 2. This is, again, this is a way of trying to really understand what is the principle underlying the no amendment clauses. Chapter 2 of Genesis says, the Lord God took the man, it's Adam, but it's just called the man, and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. Okay, we all know the story. God told Adam, don't eat of this single tree, me'etz hadat tov bara. Don't eat of that tree, because if you eat of it, you will die. Now, there's not even, God didn't give Adam a reason about, here, at least in this context, why he should not eat of that particular tree. But presumably Adam passed on or shared with Eve, his only sort of mate and only colleague in the world at that time. Oh, by the way, God told me not to eat of this particular tree. But then in the next chapter, Genesis 3, we have the story of the serpent and Eve. Now the serpent, the snake, was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts that the Lord God had made. The snake said to the woman, to Eve, it just says the woman, but it's Eve. Did God really say you shall not eat of any tree of the garden? The woman replied to the snake, we may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. It is only about fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, you shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die. Now, if we look back here, we saw God told Adam, don't eat of the tree. He didn't say anything about not touching the tree. And so Eve added this phrase and this prohibition, oh, we can't eat of this tree, but we also can't touch it. That was an addition to the instruction of God to Adam. And the serpent said to the woman, you are not going to die, but God knows that as soon as you eat of it, the fruit of this tree, your eyes will be open and you will be like divine beings who know good and bad. When the woman saw that the tree was good for eating and a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, and he ate. So this is, of course, a very famous story about sort of the original sin. And this little detail of Eve adding to the instruction of God, saying, no, we can't eat of the tree, but we also can't touch it. The rabbis made something very significant out of that. In Breshit Rabbah, a rabbinic midrash, a book of interpretation of the original book of Genesis, they are giving an interpretation or a midrashic twist on the text that we just read about the story of the serpent and Eve from Genesis chapter 3. And they point out that what Eve said, you shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die. They point out that's not what God told Adam. God told Adam, but as for the tree of knowledge and good and bad, you must not eat of it. And They cite a verse from Proverbs, do not add to God's words, lest he rebuke you and you be proven a liar. Then they go on to this quite interesting lesson. Rabbi Chia taught, this teaches that you should not make the fence around an orchard taller than the main object being protected, so it should not fall and sever the saplings. The Holy One, blessed be he, said only, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. But Eve did not say that to the serpent. Rather, she added to it and said to the serpent, oh, God told me we can't eat of it or touch it. Then the snake exploited that addition. When the snake saw her passing before the tree, it took hold of her and pushed her onto it. This is the rabbinic midrash. It said to her, see, you did not die, meaning you touched the tree, but you didn't die. Just as you did not die from touching it, so you will not die from eating it. The snake exploited the additional instruction that Eve had added to God's original command. Rather, the snake goes on, the real reason God forbade you to eat of it is that, on that day, you'll become sort of godlike. And so the rabbis, I added this, the rabbis are telling us that the addition of the further prohibition of not touching the tree, which was not part of God's commandment, actually led to Adam and Eve undermining God's command and leading to the entire rest of the Torah, essentially, once they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. So they thought, Eve may have thought that she was being particularly pious. Oh, there's a prohibition of not to eat. I'm going to add to it not to touch the tree. But actually, that led to subtracting from the Torah, undermining the Torah, because the snake exploited her not precisely conveying and following God's commandment. This is a quote from an important rabbi of the 19th and 20th century, who really sort of captures this idea that even our adding to the Torah can lead to its being undermined. Rabbi Epstein wrote, thus it seems to me the entire matter of Baal Tosif, you shall not add, ought to be understood, namely that the primary concern of this prohibition of don't add is that an addition to the Torah should not bring in its wake, that should be in its wake, a subtraction. Were it not for this concern, there's no sufficient reason. But what does it matter to us, for example, if one were to use 2 etrogim or 2 lulavim instead of 1? But according to our explanation, the matter is clear. Namely, that when a person might see concerning that which is written in the Torah tells us use only 1 etrog and 4 tefillin compartments rather than 5, that if one thought that number is not to be taken literally, he would be inclined to infer permission also to take away from the commandments. That is, to fulfill his obligation with a defective etrog or with tefillin of 3 compartments. The basic underlying reason for the prohibition of Baal Tosif, that you shall not add, is that it should not result in subtraction from the Torah, and that concern applies only to additions that an individual may make for himself by his own decision based on his own judgment, but it does not apply to the enactments of the rabbinic sages, which are general enactments for all Jews and of uncontested validity, who will not be tempted to base some other change in the law which could result in taking away and subtraction on the original enactment. So Rabbi Epstein is saying, actually, even though some contexts seem to elevate the importance of don't add over the corollary don't take away, really the don't add is itself really inferior to the more important principle of don't take away. We don't want our commitment, the obedience to our loyalty to God's Torah to be eroded by adding to it in a way that will ultimately detract from our commitment to it. And Rabbi Epstein makes clear the rabbis, rabbinic sages, and the majority consensus of the rabbis, they can make those adjustments because they have the better interests of the Torah and the people in mind. But individuals of their own accord, based on their own discretion, their own decision-making, can't make those judgments because that will lead to erosion of the people's commitment to the Torah. Okay, so this distinction between individual sort of amendments of the Torah and more general rabbinic enactments that may amend the Torah is an important one within the system. And I want to try to elaborate on that a little bit. I've already mentioned the whole topic of kashrut, about not eating meat and milk, is based on the three statements in the Torah, lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, that those 5 words are mentioned 3 different times in the Torah in different contexts. And they, in each context, they seem to be really sort of a non sequitur, unless you really delve more deeply into those 3 different contexts. The contexts are not about kashrut. So it's the plain meaning seems to be a different contextual import to this phrase, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. But this gives rise to the whole intricate system of not eating meat and milk together. And one might, as we discussed last time, one might think or argue the entire rabbinic system of kashrut, of not eating meat and milk together, represents an amendment to the Torah, because it seems clearly on its face to be supplementing the Torah, and therefore to be a violation of Bal Tosif, you shall not add. So how did the rabbis, how does the system rationalize the rabbis engaging in a process through which they arrived at a sort of a massive, intricate system of kashrut that is not present on at least the surface level of the Torah? This is from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. He makes this distinction about how we know that rabbinic treatments of the Torah can be justified. He writes, because a court may make an enactment that prohibits that which is permissible and its forbidden nature becomes permanent. That's an important sort of opening clause. The Rambam is saying a rabbinic court can prohibit something that the Torah permits, even if it's permanent. So that's part of this idea of creating a fence around the Torah. Even if the Torah permits some behavior, the rabbis can say, no, don't engage in that behavior because we're trying to protect other aspects of the Torah from being violated, and may also provisionally permit matters that are forbidden according to the Torah. So he recognized and knew that the rabbis could also sometimes, as he wrote before, sometimes in matters of exigency, provisionally, that means not permanently, permit certain matters that the Torah forbids. What then is the meaning of the Torah's warning, you shall not add anything to what I command you or take away anything from it? So what does the no amendment clause really mean? If the rabbis are empowered to add to the Torah and take away from it, it means that one may neither add to the words of the Torah nor diminish from them, and establish that matter in perpetuity as if it's from the Torah. And so Maimonides is saying, if the rabbis said, let's make certain changes to the Torah, and by the way, the Torah is saying that it's okay, that would not be allowed. So how does that relate to the whole system of kashrut that was built on the very few words, the 5 words that I read earlier, lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo? How does that play out in the system of kashrut? Maimonides writes, it is written in the Torah, you should not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And I added, these are the 3 places in which those 5 Hebrew words are written in the Torah. And Maimonides says, on the basis of an undisputed tradition. So he acknowledges it's not written in the Torah, but we have an oral tradition that is also divine in nature, traceable all the way back to Mount Sinai, transmitted through the generations. So on the basis of an undisputed tradition, we have learned that this verse forbids the cooking and eating together of meat and milk, both the meat of domesticated animals and that of predatory animals. But in contrast, eating poultry with milk is permissible from the Torah. I mentioned, I think last time, there is a Talmudic opinion. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says he believed you could actually eat chicken and milk together. So that minority opinion is preserved in the Talmud. He didn't win that argument, but he was a great rabbinic sage who thought that Jews could actually eat chicken and milk together, because that is certainly not encompassed within the plain meaning, the pshat of the 5 Hebrew words. Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, don't cook or boil a kid in its mother's milk. Thus, Maimonides writes, if some court were to declare the meat of predatory animals with milk permissible, that would constitute taking away from the Torah. Okay, we can understand that. If a court said, "Oh, even in the face of this undisputed tradition, you can eat certain meat with milk," that would be a violation of don't detract from the Torah. And if it were to forbid poultry with milk by maintaining that it is encompassed within the category of kid, and so is forbidden directly from the Torah, that would constitute adding to the Torah. Maimonides did not believe that the not eating poultry or chicken and milk was directly from the Torah. He thought that was a derabanan of a new sort of fence-creating prohibition of the rabbis. But if someone said, "Oh, not eating poultry and milk, that is traceable to the Torah itself," that would be Baal Tosif, a violation of Baal Tosif. But if the court said the eating of poultry with milk is permissible from the Torah, so the pshat, the plain meaning of the Torah is we can eat chicken and milk together, but we forbid it rabbinically by creating a fence around the Torah, and we shall inform the people that it is a rabbinic enactment in order that the matter should not produce unwanted consequences. And I won't read it all, but this, by protecting the Torah will prevent further erosion of it. This does not constitute adding to the Torah, but rather constitutes putting up a fence around the Torah, and so anything analogous to this matter. So Maimonides is saying, if rabbinic sages are upfront or explicit about the fact that the Torah doesn't say you can't have chicken and milk together, but we're going to enact a fence-creating prohibition that you shouldn't have chicken and milk together to preserve the Torah, to prevent further erosion of our obedience of the laws of kashrut, then that's okay. Now, there is a dispute in the medieval period about exactly what Baal Tosif, do not add, actually means. This is another famous rabbi of the medieval period, a Spanish rabbi, whose the acronym is Rashba. And the Rashba said he thought Maimonides was being too expansive in what would be encompassed within the prohibition of Baal Tosif. The Rashba was more protective of the authority of the rabbis to make changes. And he wrote, the rabbinic sages, never claim that Baal Tosif applies except when one, and he means, the Rashba means an individual, not the rabbinic sages, when one adds on one's own discretion and for no particular good cause. But concerning anything that the rabbinic sages instituted for some necessary cause, the Baal Tosif prohibition does not apply. For the Torah already states, you shall act in accordance with the instructions given you and the ruling handed down to you. That he's referring to the lo tasur, the you shall not deviate competing principle that we saw earlier, that gives the rabbis great authority to make enactments vis-a-vis the Torah. So the Rashba is saying, essentially anything that the rabbis do for good cause will not violate the no amendment clause. And I won't read all of this because of time, but he writes, therefore, the rabbinic sages are empowered to enact an additional requirement for a particular reason, and the same is true for Baal Tigra. So the Rashba disagreed with Maimonides. Maimonides said even rabbinic sages can run afoul of the no amendment clause if they say that the Torah prohibited or allowed something that the rabbis knew they were sort of manufacturing. And the Rashba disagreed, said, no, it's the no amendment clause is really more narrow in scope. It really can't apply to the rabbis because, in effect, the Rashba and many other rabbis came to believe, based on the Talmud, that there was not only a competing principle of lo tasur, you should not deviate from what the rabbis tell you, but it essentially, effectively in practice, the lo tasur, the do not deviate principle, became an amendment clause. So in Deuteronomy has two amendment clauses, but the Torah itself contains this competing, what came to be understood as a competing amendment clause. So the Rashba is saying, no, Maimonides, you're going too far. The rabbis essentially can do whatever they want if they have good cause for it without running afoul of the no amendment clause. It's just individual Jews that can't use their own discretion because they think they know better than God and add to or take away from the Torah. Okay. I want to spend the last part of our time this session going back to the power of rabbinic interpretation. There, as I said, there were really three methods or tactics or vehicles that the rabbis used to expand the meaning of the Torah or change the meaning of the Torah, even or despite the presence of the no amendment clauses. One was interpretation, their vast power of interpretation. I'm going to flesh that out now. The other that we've covered that I'm not going to return to really are their authority to legislate, both affirmatively and negatively, to create new prohibitions and new allowances as a fence around the Torah. So that legislative function of the rabbis was really in addition to their judicial function of interpreting the Torah. They had a legislative function of creating new law that would protect our commitment to the Torah overall. And then we saw the third, really most extreme, or perhaps one could call it the most egregious category of, they actually thought they had an amendment power, that they could actually amend the Torah in certain circumstances. But I want to return to the first of those categories, their power of interpretation, because that is by far the biggest category. It is really by far the most generative power of the rabbis to create new and expansive meaning. And this is just to follow, I see Rabbi Bolton is with us today, and this really follows up on some of the things that Rabbi Bolton was saying during our Torah discussion yesterday about how the Jewish tradition sort of develops and matures and grows up, and how do we navigate our competing commitments to tradition on the one hand, what we inherit through time, and what we know we must supplement or alter in light of new circumstances as the world moves on. And as the rabbi noted yesterday, that the pace at which the world changes is seemingly much more extreme than it used to be. And circumstances change, the Torah has to be adapted. How do we navigate that tension in growing the Jewish tradition, but maintaining our loyalty to the past at the same time? This next text is from Jay Harris's really fantastic book, How Do We Know This? Midrash and the Fragmentation of Modern Judaism. If you were at the Shabbaton, you heard me mention Jay Harris was one of my two primary advisors in my doctoral program at Columbia in Jewish Studies, along with Professor Halivni. Jay Harris was himself a star student of Professor Halivni's. He was at Columbia. After he finished his PhD at Columbia, he moved to Harvard. He's been at Harvard for decades now, and he's a top scholar of Jewish studies. And Jay Harris was Professor Mark Shapiro's, one of his two main advisors when Professor Shapiro was a graduate student at Harvard. So I was essentially Jay Harris's last PhD student at Columbia, and Professor Shapiro was Jay Harris's first PhD student at Harvard. And this is a really important book about the power of Midrash, and he's not referring to Midrash Agadah, he's referring to Midrash Halacha, the process through which the rabbis interpreted the Torah and generated new laws, how they built and created and generated the vast Jewish legal tradition out of the words of the Torah. And he wrote in that very important book, an enlightening book about the Jewish tradition, whatever one wishes to do with the agadic pronouncements that maximize what God gave to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. So if one is sort of a maximalist and said, oh, everything we do is sort of traceable to Mount Sinai, and minimize the role humans play in shaping the contours of Jewish practice, the relentless insistence on the exegetical, that means interpretative foundations of Jewish practice that dominate halachic discussions of the various rabbinic documents leaves little doubt that, in general, these documents are informed by the belief that many Jewish practices are to be derived from the Torah exegetically. That exegetically means the rabbis were interpreting the Torah and deriving new Jewish practices. For example, what I mentioned before, the entire system of keeping kosher, of not mixing meat and milk, and all of the intricate laws attached to that, those are a totally new edifice built on 5 Hebrew words in the Torah that are mentioned 3 times. But that's just one example of the vast edifice of the Jewish legal tradition that is built on the foundations of the divine Torah. And Jay is pointing out, Professor Harris is pointing out in that book, that in the majority of the Jewish legal tradition is built on this generative enterprise of rabbinic interpretation of the Torah. Exegesis of the Torah by the rabbis was the means through which the rabbis established the authority of the extra biblical laws and practices they inherited. So if they had certain traditions, the rabbis attached them to the Torah through interpretation. But importantly, it was the medium they also employed to create new laws in their own times. And it was the tool they used to resolve more far-reaching problems, such as contradictions within the Torah or between the Torah and other biblical books. Whatever the historian may wish to say about the origins of extra-biblical Jewish practice, what he means by that is almost the entirety of the Jewish halachic system that is not present in the plain sense of the Torah. The judgment of the rabbinic document, so what Jay was trying to do is understand how the rabbis thought about what they were doing themselves. The judgment of the rabbinic document seems to be beyond question. The vast majority of those extra biblical practices beyond the plain meaning of the Torah, not explicitly stated in the Bible, emerges through human exegesis of the Bible's language. So Jay goes on in that wonderful book to show that the rabbis were essentially decoding the Torah and thereby generating this enormous legal tradition. But what they thought they were doing is extracting the meaning of the divine text. They weren't, in the majority of circumstances or occasions of rabbinic interpretation of the Torah, he believes the rabbis did not have in mind, oh, I know the Bible says this, but we're going to add all sorts of things to it that we know does not comport with the divine will and is not present in the text. No, what they were doing in interpreting the text was extracting, decoding the message of the Torah that reflected God's will and God's word. There was a book a couple of decades ago called The Bible Code, I think it was called. And that it was sort of a crazy book about codes that one could read into the Torah. But in some sense, that conveys a truth. And I think, by the way, that book, the thesis was some extraterrestrial life gave us the Bible. Well, Jewish tradition believes also that the extraterrestrial entity that gave us the Torah was God, and that it's not some crazy system of decoding, but by carefully reading the Torah, the rabbis, and this continues through today, sages who have the knowledge and ability to do so can extract further meaning that is actually in the text of the Torah. They're not creating new meaning, even though it seems to be a chidush, a something that's novel, but they're actually uncovering the meaning of the Torah. Now, one could argue, we'll get to this in the next few minutes, are they actually decoding the Torah, decoding the meaning that is embedded in the Torah, or encoding meaning. That was, essentially, as an alternative perspective, adding meaning to what the words say, what the words seem to convey in their pshat, in their plain meaning. The rabbis in their interpretations were actually giving the substance, mapping the substance onto the words of the Torah. So one could view it as decoding or encoding, but either way, the rabbis were engaged in a vast process of interpretation that generated a huge structure of new law. And I want to give some examples. Many, many examples can be given, but here are a few. This is a verse from Deuteronomy. Fathers shall not be put to death on account of sons, nor should sons be put to death on account of fathers. A man shall be put to death on account of his own sin. Now, this seems to be straightforward in sort of modern critical thinking. This all basically says the same thing. Every person should be accountable for his or her own sins. Don't punish a parent or a child based on the sins of the other person. Every person is accountable for their own behavior. That's essentially what the Torah, I think any sort of reasonable reader of the Torah would understand Deuteronomy to be saying here. But to the rabbis, every single, not just word, but every single letter of the Torah had potential meaning. There was absolutely no superfluity in the Torah, nothing extra. Again, this goes back to the idea that the Torah is a perfect work, being revealed by a perfect God. So every little jot and tittle of the Torah, every word and even single letters can be invested with meaning. And it is actually our job to extract the meaning that God had in mind and that God embedded within the text of the Torah. That's what the rabbis, according to Professor Harris and many others, that's what the rabbis thought they were doing. So any textual anomaly or irregularity gives rise to the potential for new meaning, new legal supplements to the Torah based on that exegesis. So here, this is the one example. The Torah seems to be saying every person is accountable for his own behavior, but the rabbis extracted more meaning. So in interpreting, this is Deuteronomy 24:16, they interpret this. What does, and this is from a commentary on the book of Deuteronomy from the early centuries of the Talmudic period. What does this clause of the verse come to teach us? That fathers shall not be put to death on account of sons, nor sons on account of fathers. But doesn't the verse already say at the end, a man shall be put to death on account of his own sin? So the rabbi saw this really, the end of the verse really sums it up. That encapsulates the message of this verse in its entirety. So the first part of it must come to teach us something else. If the end of the verse tells us every person is accountable for his own behavior, then the first part of the verse cannot be redundant. It can't be superfluous. It is invested with greater meaning that we have to unpack. Rather, the rabbis wrote about 2,000 years ago, that clause comes to teach us that fathers shall not be put to death through the testimony of their sons, nor sons put to death through the testimony of their fathers. And when it says, and sons, so the Hebrew is lo yumtu avot al banim, uvanim lo yumtu al avot. So this vav here, not just is this entire clause invested with greater meaning and actual legal significance through which the rabbis derived a new law that relatives can't give testimony leading to the punishment of their relatives. This little letter, this single letter of the Vav, it teaches us, it includes other relatives beyond just fathers and sons or parents and children. And these are his brother, his father's brother, his mother's brother, sister's husband, the husband of his father's sister, the husband of his mother's sister, his mother's husband, his father-in-law, and his brother-in-law. So not only did they learn the additional law, relatives can't give testimony in a relative's court case, but they also extracted the additional meaning of which relatives were included within this additional prohibition. So from This simple text of the Torah, the rabbis extracted all sorts of additional legal significance. So actual practical laws, and they did not believe they were violating the No Amendment Clause. They believed they were unpacking, decoding through their vast and very acute powers of interpretation, additional legal significance. Here's another example. These are a couple of examples. I'm not going to get into the very dense and distracting detail. I'm trying to point out how the rabbis were incredibly careful readers. Again, they believed that the divine text of the Torah, every letter was potentially important, and they could extract legal significance from every letter if it seemed to be superfluous. So here's a verse from Leviticus, and if any of those swarming creatures, such as a mouse or a gecko, falls into an earthen vessel, everything inside it shall be impure. The Hebrew word is yitma, so it's a single Hebrew word, and the vessel itself you shall break. Now, again, I'm not going to get into any of the detail about this whole complex system of impurity, but there's an interesting story from the Mishnah in Tractate Sota on the same day that Rabbi Elazar ben Levi was pointing ahead. Rabbi Akiva, this is an important part. Rabbi Akiva interpreted the verse that we just read. Everything inside it shall be impure. So he interpreted the yitma, shall be impure. He said the verse does not say is impure, but rather states shall be impure, in order to indicate that not only does the vessel itself become ritually impure, but it can now render other items ritually impure. And the rabbis spent a lot of time thinking about these laws of purity and impurity. This teaches with regard to a loaf of bread that is second-degree ritual impurity. Again, I'm not going to get into the details, that it can render other food with which it comes into contact impure with third-degree impurity status. This is the important part. After hearing Rabbi Akiva's statement, Rabbi Yoshua said, "Who will remove the dirt from your eyes, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai?" So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was already dead, but he's saying, "Oh, Rabbi Yochanan would be happy, so you could live and see this," as you would say. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai used to say, in the future, another generation is destined to deem pure a loaf that contracted third-degree purity. So incorrectly reached the conclusion that the loaf of bread could be pure, as there is no explicit verse from the Torah stating that it is impure. So a future generation would determine, oh, this loaf is impure because we don't see, or we can't recall what Torah verse indicates that it is impure. But Rabbi Akiva, your disciple, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, so you'd be happy that your disciple brings a verse from the Torah indicating that it is impure, as it is stated, everything inside it shall be impure. So from this single word, yitma, Rabbi Akiva derived new meaning. And I think it's not just a case of attaching a biblical verse to an existing law so that it, as sort of what's called in rabbinic literature, an asmachta, simply a mnemonic device. I think it's more than that. They're crediting Rabbi Akiva with being brilliant enough to understand where in the Torah this additional legal significance can be derived. From where could it be extracted so that the law would not later be forgotten? Once it's tied, it's anchored, embedded within a divine verse, it is less likely to be forgotten. That's why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would have been happy that his disciple achieved that. But I think it is crediting Rabbi Akiva for decoding something in the Torah that other rabbis had not yet been able to decode. Here's another example from the book of Leviticus. "And when the daughter of a priest defiles herself through harlotry, it is her father whom she defiles, she shall be put to the fire. Ba'esh tisaref," so that means killed through burning. It's gory, but in rabbinic literature, there are various ways that the death penalty is applied, including through burning. So the plain sense of this says that if a daughter of a priest engages in some activity some sexual activity that she should not, she shall be burned. then the Talmud, the rabbis were a little bit uncomfortable about the scope of that commandment, and so they wanted to restrict it. Again, not purposefully saying, "Oh, God said this, but we're going to tell you that." I think there was some discomfort, and they wanted to really understand God's will, and they thought the law was actually more narrow than it seems, and so they confined it to daughters of priests who were either betrothed or married. Not just any daughter, but the daughter had to be sort of committed to another relationship. And again, Rabbi Akiva, who is himself a brilliant, creative interpreter of the Torah, who derived or decoded all sorts of things from details of the Torah that seem to arise from textual anomalies. He said to Rabbi Yishmael, who was famous for coming up with 13 principles of interpretation, and Rabbi Yishmael was more a proponent of the idea that the Torah spoke in human language, that we couldn't just derive infinite meaning from textual details that really shouldn't be exploited in that way. Rabbi Akiva said, "My brother, I derive it from the fact that the verse could have said the daughter of a priest, but instead it said, and the daughter of a priest." And I added the word "and." It's not even in the JPS translation. Uva. So it's just Rabbi Akiva extracted from, again, this single letter of Vav, because it says, and the daughter of a priest, that it refers to married daughters and betrothed daughters. So again, I'm not going to get into the details, but I'm including this text here because there were competing ideas of how generative rabbinic exegesis of the Torah should be, how much it really could add to the Torah when the Torah had no amendment clauses. And Rabbi Yishmael, I think, expressed some irritation, some exasperation with his brilliant colleague, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yishmael said to him, "And because you derive this from the difference between the term the daughter and the term and the daughter, so that single letter, Hebrew letter of the Vav, we should take this married daughter of a priest out to be executed by burning." So Rabbi Akiva said, it's not just betrothed daughters, it's also married daughters who are subject to this death penalty. And Rabbi Yishmael saying, "No, Rabbi Akiva, you're going too far. You can't extract that meaning. We're going to actually burn someone because you derived from a single letter this additional legal significance." So rabbinic texts reflect some competing perspectives on how far the rabbis really should go in interpreting the Torah and adding to its meaning. Okay, I'm going to end up, I only have a few texts left, and I'm going to end up with a few sort of larger thematic issues. We've seen the great power of the rabbis to interpret the Torah, which seems, again, on its face, to be in tension with the no amendment clauses. But the rabbis believe they could rationalize their own powers of interpretation, their own powers of legislation, and even their own powers of amendment under certain circumstances. So the rabbinic system justifies this great expansion and alteration of the divine text. And I mentioned earlier, Rabbi Roth suggested, well, are the rabbis really placing themselves in the role of God in this system? That wouldn't be right. And I suggested Rabbi Roth didn't believe they were doing that, even though he recognized that he had to explain the tension created by the dual authority of God and the rabbis. And this is his explanation. One may quibble about whether it's particularly satisfying, but Rabbi Roth wrote, it is possible to assert that the same action taken by two different people might in one instance be an act of ultra vires, so an act done without legal authority or in excess of one's legal authority, and the other not an act of ultra vires. The factor that would distinguish one such action from the other would be motivation. If an act is carried out by one whose intention is to establish his own systemic primacy over that even of the Torah, the act is one of ultra vires. So if a rabbinic sage or any Jewish individual said, I'm out to show that my authority is greater than God's in the Torah, that is an act that exceeds the authority that the system grants rabbinic sages. If, however, the action is motivated by a real concern for the preservation of the primacy of the Torah itself within the halakhic system, and if the situation is such that this preservation can be accomplished best through the abrogation of one of its dictates. So we saw before that the Torah can be abrogated, amended in certain circumstances. The very act of abrogation, which in the first case, so someone motivated by sort of self-interested and aggrandizing motivation, in that case of ultra-vires, that would be one of exceeding authority, but it would not be so in the second case of someone motivated by proper interests about preserving the Torah. And in the context, Rabbi Roth makes clear that proper motivation is yirat shamayim, fear of heaven. So that's how Rabbi Roth sort of navigates, or says the rabbinic tradition navigates. How do we know when we're actually exceeding our authority, when we're actually running afoul of the no amendment clause in the Torah? It goes to motivation, which could be very subjective, very hidden. It could be concealed. But if one is doing it for the sake of heaven, for the sake of preserving Torah, then even the amendment of the Torah can be rationalized. Now, I said one can quibble about that because different actors can say they're equally motivated by the fear of heaven, and outside observers can reach different conclusions about their motivations. But this is a way of explaining why systemic authorities, rabbinic sages within the system, have actually great discretion to do what they want with respect to the Torah without violating the no amendment clause, because systemically recognized authorities have the proper motivation. Okay. I want to end by, and again, this relates to something Rabbi Bolton was talking about yesterday, but the two sort of competing pulls that we have in the modern period are commitment, which are, namely, on the one hand, our commitment to the past, to what we've inherited through tradition, and our desire to preserve as much as we can of the past, and the sort of ruptures that have been created in the modern period through changed circumstances and different sensibilities about the meaning of the Torah. So this is from, I've just taken two texts that I hope will exemplify those competing pulls on our feelings as Jews in the modern period. This is from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. Again, I won't get into the details of what was above, but the above concepts applied only when the High Court of the land of Israel would sanctify the new moon based on the observation of witnesses. So this goes back to the system of, in ancient times, the Sanhedrin would send out witnesses to tell us when the new month emerged. And based on that witness testimony, we would start Jewish holidays. So the calendar was fully contingent on proper witness testimony. And then that testimony, news of that testimony, would be sent out to diaspora communities. And in contrast, Jews in the diaspora would celebrate 2 days as a holiday to avoid the doubt about the calendar, because it would take some time for the news to reach them, for they did not know the precise date on which the inhabitants of the land of Israel sanctified the new moon. But over time, the calendar became fixed. So in the ancient times, when we didn't have a fixed calendar on which we could rely, we had to depend on witness testimony. And because of Jews lived in outlying areas, they couldn't be exactly sure of when a new month would start. Maimonides, by the time of Maimonides, there was a fixed calendar. And he wrote in the Mishnah Torah, at present, however, as the inhabitants of the land of Israel follow a fixed calendar and sanctifying new months with no witnesses, the second day of a holiday, so we still, as I mentioned earlier, we still have the second days of Yontif, right? We just celebrated Pesach. As I mentioned, the Torah tells us only the first day should be a holy occasion, but we in the diaspora celebrate 2 days. Why is that not a violation of what Rashi told us was a clear violation of the No Amendment Clauses? We're adding quantitatively to what the Torah told us to do. So in the ancient times, they had to have a second day of Yontif, of the holiday, because they were unsure of the precise calendar. But once the calendar is fixed, there's no need for a second day in light of unclarity about witness testimony. But we still maintain the second day of the holiday, not to avoid a calendrical doubt, but to preserve a custom. And I'm including this here because the whole idea of our maintaining a second day of holidays, of Yontif, is really just because we used to do it that way. So the power of minhag, the power of custom, because one could think, oh, we've now made permanent what was a supplement to the Torah that would run afoul of the No Amendment Clause. But there is this competing idea that custom is so powerful, that our commitment to the past is so compelling, that we should, and we do. At Or Zarah, we do. And in all of the traditional Jewish world, we still celebrate 2 days of Yontif, not because we have any uncertainty about the calendar, because the calendar is fixed to the second, but we do it out of our allegiance to custom. So this, to me, is a great example of our commitment to the past and to tradition. On the other hand, I'm going to end with this. This is a passage from a modern rabbi. He's no longer living, but he was sort of a modern traditionalist rabbi who came into contact with what he understood as heresy. And the heresy really goes back to everything we've been talking about. And this, I'm including it here because this is sort of a tease for modern times. The whole rabbinic system of interpreting the Torah really became scrutinized and attacked and challenged over the centuries. And there was real sort of embarrassment from within the Jewish tradition, a need to defend the rabbi's expansive and sometimes highly creative derivation of meaning from the plain sense of the Torah. And heretics through time made fun of the rabbinic powers of interpretation and said, that's not what God meant us to do. And this rabbi saying, he wrote there, I recall the first piece of heresy I heard from his, and he was referring to a colleague in his youth, Abraham Herschel, from his mouth regarding the scriptural interpretation of Rabbi Ishmael, whom we read about before, of why it says, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk 3 times. So rabbinic tradition tells us that the Torah says those 5 Hebrew words 3 different times. One might think, just say it once, God, we don't need to hear it 3 times. But the 3 times, always, there's never redundancy or superfluity in the Torah. Each occasion is there to allow us to unpack further meaning. So one time is to prohibit cooking, one time to prohibit eating of meat and milk, and one time to prohibit deriving any benefit from meat and milk, which, by the way, means you can't serve a cheeseburger in a restaurant. And this rabbi, this traditionalist rabbi, is saying when he heard that sort of heresy, it pricked his heart like a needle in live flesh until I got used to Abraham Herschel's mockery. And this was the mockery that really cuts to the core of the validity of the vast power of rabbinic interpretation vis-a-vis the written Torah. Thus would he joke. So this guy, Abraham Herschel, would joke. Moses knew that the Jews are shrewd, and their way is to distort the meaning of the scriptures and to remove words from their simple meaning. So Moses knew, oh, Jews, they engage in this crazy exegesis of what I'm going to tell them, and they take words out of context. So Moses knew that they would come to interpret a kid in its mother's milk, those 5 Hebrew words, as applicable broadly, implying all meat and milk, as we do today. So Moses, this mocker of the rabbinic tradition, Moses therefore went to the trouble of repeating himself and wrote a second time explicitly, I said it once, but I'm saying it again. Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk, to specifically exclude as unkosher only a kid, a baby goat, and specifically only in its mother's milk. And then Moses thought, I'm going to do it a third time because these Jews are so shrewd and they engage in such fanciful interpretation. I'm going to say it a third time. So he thus taught it a third time, specifically prohibiting a kid in its mother's milk, and not this expansive meaning. And Herschel, the mocker, said, what did Rabbi Yishmael do nevertheless, despite the plain sense of what Moses was just repeating himself for emphasis, not for someone to derive additional meaning. But Rabbi Yishmael, as representative of the rabbinic system, came and interpreted the threefold appearance of that statement as meaning three separate things: do not cook, do not eat, and do not derive benefit. And in this way, this guy Herschel would mock the scriptural interpretations of the sages. And this was just an example of what we've been talking about. The rabbi's great power of interpretation became a source of heresy and mockery through the centuries by both outsiders, by Christians in particular, and Muslims as well, but also by Jews. And that's how that's described in Jay Harris's wonderful book, among others. That's how Judaism, at least in part, became fragmented in the modern period. That this issue of Midrash Halacha, of the Jewish interpretation of Scripture, became a source of contention and derision. Jews, just confining it within the Jewish context, Jews started to say, that's not what God meant in the plain meaning of the text. You rabbis, and through the centuries, you generated meaning that does not comport with God's will. You have amended the Torah, you have supplemented in ways that God did not want. And that gave rise to the more liberal denominations in Judaism that no longer had the same commitment and loyalty and obedience to the tradition that they came to believe was ill-founded, that did not have the proper foundations in the Torah, and that represented fanciful rabbinic interpretation over time. So one could understand the sort of fragmentation of Judaism into different denominations as, at least in part, derived from this debate about the nature and validity of rabbinic interpretation of the Torah. So with that, I know the time is short, but if anyone has questions or comments, Rabbi, I see you're raising your hand.
Mark, Yishar Koach, good morning. So glad to have made a session live on the first two, and now this one. I just want to say overall, you're again presenting so beautifully the classic texts of our tradition, the way your mind organizes them. It's like having the right conductor at a symphony, or the architect who creates the building and in the space of what great city we love to visit, like a Jerusalem of sorts. And I really believe that you bring us closer to those, the glowing coals within the letters, the white space too. That said, you inspire me this morning, and on the heels of some of the conversation, that we have been having over time on these issues in the Beit Knesset, and especially just recently, which you mentioned. I think that part of listening to your words over the last couple of sessions have really brought me to reconsider. And then Rabbi Arama, who said that it's sometimes within our hearts to connect ourselves to tradition, just like that second day Yontiv issue. And then sometimes it's the matter of having to rationalize our connection to it because it might seem almost irrational. And the real, to me, the negative or underbelly part of abusing midrashic or hermeneutic approaches makes us so negative when it comes to seeing the fragmentation. But it reminds me of Professor Heinemann's work about midrash. And he said that the rabbinic hermeneutical process is among the most holy word games that any human being has ever undertaken. and that if you could sense the Kedusha in it, and that we're really moving towards Kedusha, we are making explicit some of what is foundationally within the system that you have now taught everybody about so clearly. So that said, I want to ask you about, where is that text? Because I missed it on the source sheets. Where is the text about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and their hope that he would be, or someone would wake him up to see how beautiful it was, that there was the hermeneutical move?
Where is it actually located?
With Yitma, where was that source? In the Gemara?
Yes, I mean, that passage is from the Talmud. Yes, from the Gemara in the Babylonian Talmud. But you know,
which tractate?
Yeah, I don't have the screen in front of me, the source sheet, but I will let you know.
Maybe you could send me the links to the source sheets,
okay,
to the 3 weeks, so I can listen again.
I will do that.
And but here's the question. You made me think of an intertext, a very famous intertext, which I think you've presented. I can't remember when you brought the other text. Rabbi Akiva is teaching. Moses is dispatched into his classroom in Menachot. Rabbi Akiva interprets an issue. The issue is not particularized. It's simply that he was teaching an issue. Moses is confused. How could the rabbi do this? And he uses the phrase, it was Torah leMoshe miSinai. It was Torah given to Moses on Sinai, which in a certain sense highlights the mythological loyalty connection that Jews feel to the tradition. On the other hand, this text you brought today says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is among the chief interpreters of Torah tradition, hermeneutical, rabbi himself, says that one needs to take a word like Yitma and do a very detailed halachic midrashic read on the text. And the two of them together, I think, represent, in a way that I've not seen these two texts stand by each other, the mythological loyalty kind of to Sinai, a shared revelation notion, and a hermeneutical kind of appreciation that's within the tradition. So those two texts now are just glowing in my tour of the rabbinic literature that you've brought forward.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi, for bringing that up. I have taught that story about Moses entering Rabbi Akiva's classroom, but I think you're remembering I discussed it with Professor Shapiro during our lunch dialogue.
That's it. It wasn't on the recordings,
right? So, but you're very right to point out that in that story, Moses it says he was comforted because he couldn't understand the discussion, and then when Rabbi Akiva says, "Oh, by the way, it's attributable to a tradition traceable all the way back to Moses," that he was comforted. It's interesting that in this story that we discussed today, the rabbis are saying, "Oh, Rabbi Yochanan would have been happy." So it's an interesting juxtaposition of sort of Moses feeling that his confusion was relieved, but here Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would have been happy that, I think Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's concern was that a law could be forgotten if it were not anchored in a biblical text, and he was happy that, oh, such a great student of his could derive and attach it to the biblical verse, again, not artificially or just mnemonically, but actually anchor it in a text and create that additional derivative meaning so that the law would not be forgotten. And getting back to your earlier comment, I think that it is some of what Rabbi Roth mentioned, that even if one comes to the conclusion that the rabbis were creative but fanciful interpreters, and that a lot of the Jewish legal tradition is not sort of properly tied to the biblical text, one can still have, so even if one reaches that conclusion, I'm not saying I do, but if one does, you can still have great respect for what the rabbis believe they were doing, which is they were trying to make sure that they were comporting with God's will. And I know, as Professor Halivni taught me, the rabbis never, he believed, and I was persuaded by him, never believed that a biblical law, for example, was immoral. You know, the law, for example, of the rebellious son, and the Torah tells us a rebellious son should be put to death in certain circumstances. The rabbis were uncomfortable with that law and essentially, practically interpreted it out of existence. But Dr. Halivni believed they did not have in mind that the law itself was immoral, and therefore they had to reach a foregone outcome that it was going to be interpreted out of existence. He believed the rabbis really thought, oh, God could not have meant that. We have to understand what God really meant. We have to unpack the meaning of the words of the Torah. And so they were not result driven in that respect. They were genuinely trying to derive the meaning that they thought God had in mind for them. And so even if one thinks that there's too much of a disconnect between the plain sense of the Torah, the pshat of the Torah, and the drash of the rabbis, the project, the enterprise of the rabbis themselves can be respected, I think should be, because they believed they were engaged in a sacred task. Anyone else? Charlie.
Yeah, I'm mute. Not too long ago, you presented a class on the importance of study, and that study was the most important activity we can do. How does interpretation of the Torah relate to achieving that goal of study, as opposed to just reading the Torah and taking either a first blush acceptance of what the Torah is saying, or just basically not thinking about it? So are we, by interpreting Torah and studying all the sages and the Talmud and the Mishnah and Midrash, are we fulfilling that obligation, and also using the blessing of wisdom as we are thankful for in the Amidah, when we say the blessing for wisdom in the Amidah?
Yeah, so the short answer, Charlie, is yes, of course. That's what the rabbis meant, that we shouldn't just read the Torah perfunctorily and sort of aimlessly, but we need to try to understand its meaning for our lives. You're referencing the debate in rabbinic literature about which is primary sort of behavior, conduct, or study. And one opinion is that study is primary because it will lead to behavior. But yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. The process of interpreting the Torah means the study of Torah. So one could read all the prior rabbinic commentaries, and that could lead to one's own insights about the Torah. But yes, studying the tradition, the tradition of rabbinic interpretation is what they meant by study of Torah. And one can come up with novel ideas.
And then we have fulfilled that obligation.
Yes, we have fulfilled the study of obligation, and that in turn will lead to, presumably, a greater commitment to perform what we're supposed to do.
Okay.
All right, it's late. I'm gonna wrap it up there. But thank you everyone for participating. I'm glad you could join me for my my 25th year of teaching the class, and I look forward to many more years to come.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of the day.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Shar Koach.
Yeah, sure.